Hi everyone, this is Philosophy for the People with Stefan Bertram and just Stefan Bertram. Once again, Ben remains very busy these days, sufficiently so that this is planned. What I'm going to do today is planned to be a series of this one and the one I'm going to do next week. And we are starting with, at least the title is, Tolkien and Imperialism, Fantasy Reaction, and the Left. I put Tolkien and Imperialism on the advice of a friend in that kind of title would get people to click on the video. But perhaps more aptly, the title of this video should be Tolkien and Spengler. Spengler being an early 20th century reactionary who I think in his work very much embodies the same worldview that Tolkien puts about in Lord of the Rings. That obviously, as Tolkien was writing about a fictional world, he can kind of just make himself right in his own world. While with Spengler, he's kind of confronted with the real world, the reality of it, and we can more broadly say he was wrong or incorrect. So yes, going to talk about that today. Yes. Tolkien's account of history is one I think is really obviously fundamentally reactionary and regressive. Fundamental to Tolkien's account of history is this idea that the days have gone down in the West, the world has faded, and so on and so on. And this is true no matter how far you go back in any of Tolkien's prose stories about Middle Earth. Always, like even if you're talking about older tales of the Second Age, of the pursuit of the Silmarils by the Noldor, you still have a situation where things have fallen, have become less than the earliest days before the rise of Morgoth, before Sauron was a twinkle in Morgoth's eye, and he was just going about being a nice guy. Before the sun was made, and so on, and it's a constant fading, and this fading is cyclic, but in the sense that circling the drain is cyclic. So you have, for instance, so in the Lord of the Rings, at the start of the books, the situation is very much faded, declined. The free people of Middle Earth are in a great state, in a very poor state, in a great state of terribleness, I meant to say. And we can see that, like, the war that was fought at the end, the battle where they're confronting the forces of Mordor at the gates of Mordor, is not a one where the forces of the free people of Middle Earth had any chance. And notably, it's not the free people of Middle Earth that's there. There's one wizard, two hobbits, an elf, a dwarf, and then several hundred men against tens and tens of thousands of orcs that would very easily crush them. Compare that to the previous time the free peoples of Middle Earth confronted Mordor in the War of the Last Alliance. That was tens of thousands of Númenórean soldiers, men, and elves. And they're only saved by the brave actions of two hobbits. And this is a fading where at the end of the books, Gondor is revived, the world is revived, things have got much better by the end of the books, but it's still in a faded position, and we know that these ancient deeds will never come back, that the world has become more comfortable, but never again will the great majesty and beauty and magic of, say, the Elven realms ever be revived. We know that these realms are fading, or it's told us explicitly that by defeating Sauron, Galadriel's ring will stop working, and that will lead to the fading of her realm. And it's interesting, of course, old people will tell you that it was better back in their days, and as we'll get to later in the discussion of this, because a large part of this discussion is also going to focus on how this account of history lines up with the real world. This is not the nostalgia of distant generations, but we know, or at least we have very good reason to think, that these previous ages were not faded ones, were really better than the present time, because people like Elrond were there. Elrond was at the Battle of the Last Alliance and fought there and saw the folly of men doom and cause the by whatever it's called, failing to destroy the ring. This doomed the world and forced the kind of Cyronic cycle to continue on, which forced the events of the Lord of the Rings to happen. And Elrond knows that this war is a faded remnant of the previous one, but he also knows that the War of the Last Alliance is a faded remnant of the battle against Morgoth, where he was also present. So Mordor and Sauron go for the same cycle, where they reach a point of great strength and then are diminished and destroyed. But it's less clear when Sauron was at its greatest power. It might be in the second war, in the War of the Last Alliance, because obviously it can't really be the last war because he never got his ring back. Yes, as a kid, well, it's funny because obviously Saruman and Sauron are connected, but you think as a kid reading it, the connection is much more strong because they have similar names. And the relevance of this sort of text and why it's so interesting now, perhaps more interesting even than when Tolkien wrote it at the time, was that when Tolkien wrote, you can reasonably say the days had not gone down in the West. Of course, the First World War was a complete disaster, wrecked Europe, and set it on the road where it's proceeded now to the one where it no longer dominates the world. But there was plenty of life and vitality left in Europe. And even after the Second World War, there was still a little life and vitality left in Europe. But things really have gone down now, especially in Europe. Something that seems especially sharp over the past 2 months since Trump has come into power and has, seeks to withdraw the guard from the East. The new West of the United States seeks to disentangle itself from the old West of Europe. For a time, the days were going down in the West in the sense that its global power was declining, Europe's global power was declining, but at the same time, the status of ordinary people increased. This was the social democratic project in Europe, where the empires of Europe were slowly abolished, and this was meant to lead to kind of a reward among normal people, where they would be increased in status. And the final kind of giving out of this was in the early 90s, where there was a peace dividend, where military budgets were massively cut after the USSR was unfortunately defeated. The Old West, Europe, is now trying to revive its hard power after this apparent betrayal by the United States, but it all seems very much too late. And why these stories about the decline of the West seem so relevant now. So it's not just obviously that Tolkien wrote these works and they directly influenced us as persons, but also that they massively influenced other literature. Powerful literature does not exist separately from the world, and while our present moment is reflective of themes laid out in Lord of the Rings, we can understand our world better through thinking about Lord of the Rings. Our present moment also directly uses Lord of the Rings to understand the world. Lord of the Rings is very much prominent within the Ukrainian, Russian, American, and Italian right wing. And, much to the horror of Tolkien, if he was around, Lord of the Rings has become part of the universalized global bigness of the world. I'll talk about this more later, but Tolkien wished to kind of give the disenchanted Saxons of Northwest Europe their own mythology. Part of encouraging Britain, the Saxons, to turn away from great empire towards like the care and deep rootedness of their own nation, and was also warned about kind of global cosmopolitan culture, but then so influential was his own works that they became part of this global culture. And not only that, they're more influential outside of the original circumstance, where Russians and Ukrainians are far more intensely into Lord of the Rings than British people are. My main suggestion today is that Lord of the Rings is highly Spenglerian. That's a hard one to say. In its structure, in large part, this revealing is done for its own sake. It's interesting to talk and think about how these themes are reflected. We're, just doing straightforward literary analysis. But once it's accounted for, I will return to discuss the relevance of these themes in our present moment, as I've already been doing. It's important to remember, to note, to hold the truth of that literature can be beautiful and reactionary, and there can be even much that can be taken from it, and that literature still be reactionary. Reactionaries often regret the wrong things and wish towards the wrong things, but can provide a useful model of the world, one I think which is less tied up in mainstream ideology than conservative or liberal theories. Conservative liberal mainstream ideology is. Yes, very much so. And there's also those weird articles recently from the American right. Lord of the Rings was massive in Italy, originally in its first generation with the hippies and so on. But as I'm sure we all think now, hippies were not exactly like the great ideological revolutionaries of our past that put us on the real path. Well, I think it's useful to kind of distinguish what's going on there when we mean imperialism or imperialist. It's perfectly reasonable to say that Tolkien was a racist, but he wasn't interested in British imperialism. So I think we can denounce him for the things you're saying here. Not liking brown people, plausible enough, but that doesn't mean then he's an imperialist. Tolkien wanted instead petty nationalism. I'm mostly relying on here a text, an academic paper called Spenglerian Tropes in Lord of the Rings 2016 by Potts. He writes that these are the Spenglerian tropes and themes in Lord of the Rings. The conception of a Western civilization that was once great but has lost its vitality in its decline, most obviously in the case of Gondor. The use of organic metaphors to describe such a cyclic view of history. The planting of the white tree in Minas Tirith, the flowering of the white tree in Minas Tirith, and what Sam does to bring back plants in Hobbitville, whatever it's called, the Shire. An outfit which is anti-imperialist but nationalist, as I've just been discussing. And most of all, the idea of Western civilization as Faustian, both impelled but also doomed by the desire to always see more, know more, and to be compelled to try and appropriate more, and so exhaust itself in this effort. Yeah, so we never want to say that Tolkien is woke, and also at the same time not just straightforwardly denounce him as a racist, because obviously, yes, he was not enthused with, he was certainly not enthusiastic racist, and he opposed most of the worst things of his time, like notably was very much a Philio-Semite. Well, that's a thing soon, as we'll get to on the end of this. Russians are generally happy to be the Orcs in the equation. Demutation, I don't think that's how it's pronounced, but sadly I don't have anyone with me to correct myself. Or fading is an omnipresent mood in the Lord of the Rings. I've already mentioned this, fading present in the three great wars witnessed by Elrond. But it's also notable that this fading is embedded in kind of the successes, in the qualities that make it great. This is why it's a fading, but also cyclic fading. Even the elves, who most of all, I think this is kind of one thing that's been somewhat lost in later interpretations of the elves. In the Lord of the Rings, the elves are just better in every single way. They are Tolkien's guys. And of course, they still do bad things. I'm not really in the Third Age, but in the Second Age. I mean, in the Third Age, in the Lord of the Rings, what they seem, I don't think Tolkien meant them to seem this way, but what they seem like is enormous fucking cowards. Such cowards that Peter Jackson in the film in Helm's Deep had to invent the scene where Elrond sends some soldiers to come help at Helm's Deep. In the books, Elrond sent 0 soldiers to help anyone at any point in the Lord of the Rings. But even the elves can't escape this internal historical logic. Their effort to prevent decay while still living in mortal historical Middle-earth leads to them becoming embalmers, as Tolkien says. They try to create this beautiful, sure civilization, but this is only possible by fading deeper and deeper into the woods. Even the most virtuous civilization, the elves, can do nothing but preserve itself for longer. The wisdom of the elves can win them nothing but the knowledge of the inevitability of their own decline. This is very clear with the elves and the Lord of the Rings. They know it's so over for them. Yes, you would think so, and traditionally, yeah, Ukrainians should also be orcs, but that's basically the kind of symmetry or conflict or dialectic or tension, whatever going on, where the Ukrainians are seeking to become the elves. They wish to be part of the normal modern West, though, of course, as we all know, that's not going to happen for various reasons. As we've already discussed, also, imperialism in Lord of the Rings is seen as an ideology that even its greatest triumph is sowing the seeds of its own decline and reversal, as exploited becomes exploited and the colonizer becomes colonized. Numenor, the guys that Aragorn is part of, and so is Gondor and so on, Numenor always made its own doom. It does so over and over again. It went out and crushed Sauron. This is before even the War of the Last Alliance. Sauron was just kind of like doing shit, I think, like in the early Second Age. He was like kind of just doing shit. And so the Numenorians got in boats, went over, and they didn't even fight him. They just went up to his tower, and they were so big and scary, he just surrendered. But it's only because they went out and did this imperialism, which was the start of their empire upon the continent of Middle-earth, start of their colonies and so on. But this is exactly why they fell, because they took Sauron back to that island as a prisoner, and as a prisoner there, he convinced them to engage in the folly of Numenor, where they got on their ships with Sauron and tried to attack heaven, basically. They tried to sail their ships to heaven. And Soon has put in the chat here, what the fuck was Sauron thinking was going to happen when he got on this boat to attack heaven? And what obviously happens is that God just smited them and turned the world into a globe, and Sauron got fucked up and diminished for 1,000 years. Of course, in the end, it finally, after a long, long time, worked out for him, but it took a long time. And then again, it was this imperial grasping, this desire for power, which got Numenor to its strength, but then also destroyed it in the War of the Last Alliance, where this Numenorian king, Isildur, I think. No, it wasn't Isildur. Whatever, doesn't really matter his name. He took the ring, as we see at the start of The Lord of the Rings, and wasn't willing to destroy it because he wanted its power for himself. Potts also highlights in his paper how their imperial infrastructure is used against them. He doesn't mention this. He mentions mostly the roads coming out of the south, which are the roads that the enemies of Gondor march on were mostly built by Gondor, as well as the fortress of Saruman, which he used to attack Rohan, was also of Númenórean make, was also of Gondorian make. But also, perhaps most obvious of all these fucked up places like Minas Morgul were also originally of Númenórean make, were originally of Gondorian make. The only exception, the only one that Sauron actually built is Barad-dûr, his big-ass tower. Yeah, certainly. I'm wondering, was that stuff kind of up and going by the time Tolkien was writing? The decline of Gondor. When Pippin rides through the countryside surrounding Minas Tirith, he noticed that the herdsmen and husbandmen that dwelt there were not many, as the most part of the people of Gondor lived in the seven circles of the city. So this is always really interesting when you watch the film. In the film, they're between Minas Tirith and the River Anduin and Osgiliath, or it's called, there's nothing, which seems so absurd, right? You never have a city of like 1 million people or 500,000 people, 100,000 people, and then there's just a big wall, and then there's just untilled grassland for miles and miles and miles. And of course, in the books, the situation is not quite that absurd, but actually more than any possible real city, it is the case of Minas Tirith that somehow Minas Tirith is this great city surrounded by nothing. And this is kind of the perfect metaphor for the decline of Gondor, and also incredibly aligned with the works of Spengler, who continually emphasizes this. I forget the exact terminology, though. I think I might have highlighted it in a later slide, of this like stone-walled city, which slowly drains out all the strength of the country into it, and then itself fades away and declines and decays. Childless lords sat in aged halls, musing on heraldry. In secret chambers, withered men compounded strange, strong elixirs, or in high cold towers asked questions of the stores. And this concern with childlessness is a concern that's very much present in Spengler and Tolkien, but again, notably, was not that much of a problem back in their day. They were having plenty of kids in the early 20th century, everywhere. But now we have a problem with not having enough children, where we really are this decaying civilization, which is not able to reproduce itself. And for both Spengler and Tolkien, the fullness of rural life is required for a strong society. At the point where these great stone cities start exhausting the rural life, such that the rural life can't reproduce itself, that's when a civilization begins to decline. But of course, as I was mentioned, there's not this decline of Gondor in the books, but at the end of the book, there's a revival of Gondor. There's continual references to a proud and glorious past, but no hope for any meaningful future except for the distant legend of the king of the original bloodline, which is, of course, what in fact comes to pass. Contemporary authors would invariably subvert this, but Tolkien did not. And what's really interesting is how incredibly un-Faustian, un-modernist this idea is, where Gondor is not revived through any kind of industrial process. It's not that Aragorn, the classic thing that J.R.R. I've forgotten his name, the guy that wrote Game of Thrones. What the fuck? JR, whatever, that guy. He always, he had a thing of like, oh, what's Aragon's tax policy? Which is a weird thing for him to say because there's absolutely no tax policy discussed in A Game of Thrones and A Song of Ice and Fire. J.R. Martin, there's absolutely no tax policy discussed in his works, but it does make very clear that what is happening in the revival of Gondor is not any kind of modernist process where, because of like his astute stewardship, Aragon revives the kingdom. Rather, it's a spiritual revival. It's like a blessing from heaven, because that's what the men of Numenor are. With their long lives, they're blessed by the heavens. And as that gift fades away, that's a withdrawal of this gift from the heavens. There's nothing. It's so unmodernist in the reasons for the revival. But what's notable is that Aragon's kind of personal virtue causes a revival of the kingdom, the revival of the spirits of men, of their nature, but this immediately begins to fail. Not just in the tales that Tolkien decided not to write, The New Shadow, which was a story about how, like 100 years after Aragon died, men basically immediately turned back to doing evil. They like started cults where like young men would run around pretending to be orcs and like proclaiming like their loyalty to Sauron or whatever, even though of course Sauron was diminished and destroyed at that point, which I don't know if that's meant to be a parody of like neo-fascism or whatever, but it sounds a lot like neo-fascism. But yeah, also basically a couple generations after Aragon, who lived hundreds of years, and his son who lived hundreds of years, or at least 200 years, their line goes back to being like 80 or 90 years old, which is basically the setup for these men eventually transitioning into becoming the men of our age, which is kind of the point of the Lord of the Rings being this mythic history of our own era. But in the count of years, I've already said that one. Oh, right, no, I haven't. But in the count of years, Aragon lived long, but less than the years of his ancient forefathers. So even though Aragon, in the Third Age, is far and away the most virtuous man of his time, he doesn't have anything on his forefathers. He lives 250 years, I think. His forefathers lived 400. We're complaining about dragon egg prices. I mean, if we were writing a reasonable account, then yes, I would think so. But of course, we kind of know that this isn't what happens because Tolkien never wrote about it, and we know that kind of that time is an ancestry of ours. So, in fact, probably what happens is men diminish and diminish and diminish until they return to a state of hunter-gathering, which then eventually set it up for our era to happen. Thanks. Perhaps the most obvious influence of Spengler. To be clear, when I'm talking about the influence of Spengler, I don't mean he literally influenced Tolkien, though he might have through secondary sources. But this is never a question where I don't particularly worry about like whether one literally influenced the other, but rather just does it seem that way? Can we draw out the similarities? Like the actual facts, I don't think really matter. Is the identification of the Faustian impulse, the desire for progress, the desire to always understand more, to possess more, to know more, one which possesses us in the West, or it should. I hope it still does. It's very much something that possesses me, and I think it's very much for the best, and is essential to the progress of capitalism and reaching socialism and so on. But for Tolkien and for Spengler, the Faustian impulse is something demonic and immense, and is represented by Sauron and later Saruman as well. Saruman falls to Sauron because he wishes to seek far. It's in his use of the ball, very bad with specialized terms, the far-seeing magic ball he has, from looking into that year after year, and then Sauron looking back upon him, is his desire to know more that he falls to Sauron and so makes his own doom. In his arrogance and his desire for power, he destroys himself and ruins everything he has, and diminishes and dies in the end as a man in essence. So if you read the paper, I'm not really going to go into it. But if you read the paper, basically Tolkien did read someone who was very heavily influenced by Spengler and spent a chapter talking about Spengler. So Tolkien read that chapter, but there's no evidence he read it directly. But again, I don't think it really matters. The destructive drive towards progress is one of the most obvious themes of Lord of the Rings, such that I don't think that much time needs to be spent on it. But what is more notable is what this requires then. What does Sauron and Saruman and the forces of evil and Morgoth and so on then require of the free people of Middle-earth? Bigness is required of the free people of Middle-earth. Tolkien admires most of all in the Third Age, which most best fits with his counting of the world, is the hobbits. But the hobbits couldn't defeat Sauron. Well, in some sense they do, but only because of their collaboration with Aragorn and the bigness of Gondor are they able to see. Palantir is a seeing eye. Of course, I should remember Palantir because it's now the name of an evil US company who does evil things. And so Tolkien wishes virtuous people not to aim towards bigness, but to aim towards like an embeddedness in their land and a happiness with kind of their own homeland and so on. But of course, when there's evil forces out there, then bigness is required of you. And I think I don't have to be explicit when how that can relate to the present situation in Europe. But of course, we're not necessarily correct about who exactly is evil and who is not. I would like to think so, but sadly I'm not. I've already mentioned it quite a lot, but it's useful to now go in properly on this idea of nationalistic anti-imperialism. Potts writes, a mood of anti-imperialist nationalism that was emerging at the close of the 19th century and was concerned with the emphasizing the importance of attending cultural vitality at home rather than the imperial venturing abroad was something that influenced both Tolkien and Spengler. This is the idea that when a nation reaches out towards the world and intervenes, it doesn't revive itself, but rather exhausts itself. And we can see this very clearly with the United Kingdom, where the United Kingdom basically bankrupted itself in the First World War. It sold massive amounts of its global assets off to US capitalists, which then ensured that the hegemony transitioned past it. But while already the British Empire was doomed in one form or another at the end of World War I, despite the fact that they won, Britain won that war and then reached the zenith of its global territorial control in the aftermath of World War I. But this great empire was then unsustainable by this exhausted polis, the exhausted metropole. It exhausted itself by reaching out to Europe, intervening in Europe in a way that it never had before. And then the Second World War comes along and Britain wins again. But at that point, its kind of ideology, its perception of the world of direct empire is over. The United States model of indirect empire is instead the one that's imposed upon the world. And when the UK, in collaboration with France, next tries to properly reimpose its imperial power through hard force in the Suez Crisis, the US says no, and then it's over for the British Empire. So it was exactly by reaching out, by winning these wars, that Britain exhausted itself and diminished from an empire. Such anti-imperialist nationalist pride, which rejected the equation of greatness with bigness, is evident in the mythos of Middle-earth, in which Tolkien wanted to create a literary word, as he put it, redolent of our air, the clime and the soil of the Northwest. Though I think probably the thing he would be most sad about Lord of the Rings is that it's not filmed. It was never filmed. None of them are filmed in the United Kingdom. They go off to New Zealand, which of course has a similar climate, but more shockingly impressive geography. This is a notion which is essential to the present situation of Europe. Empire faded in favor of improvements in home, but then these improvements faded away, and before any effort that could be made to revive them, Europe has declared that it must again put a watch, man the walls, and put a watch on the east. Any kind of hope for the European working class must now come through like Keynesian military spending, which is only going to again profit the United States. Yeah, I mean, of course, I know you mean diminished present. So, yeah, of course, Tolkien was very, very Catholic. But what we have in the Bible, so there is also, I mean, very directly with the Age of the King stuff, that is happening in the Bible, where there is this decline in the Age of Kings. But mostly what's happening in the Bible is one great fall, where men doom themselves, while there isn't this one great fall in the Lord of the Rings, because while Tolkien is very Catholic in his influences, he didn't want to directly tell out the story of the Bible or so on in the books. That's much more something that happens in A Lion, a Witch, and a Wardrobe. Yeah, like also, I mean, there's a classic racist desire for the United States not to engage in imperialism, because the United States, due to its kind of Republican kind of legacy, feels the need that if it conquers some province, it needs to at least some degree integrate the people there. But if the people integrated there are of the wrong sort, then fantasy, I think, as a genre, as a theme, grows more appealing every year, as our reality diminishes, which draws out a central irony. That Tolkien wanted Lord of the Rings to provide a mythos to disenchant factions, and this in large part worked. I really like that if you Google something was like, when was the last time an elven army was raised, you get presented to you an answer which just as if Lord of the Rings is mythic history of our world. The top answer is always Lord of the Rings, and it's presented in this kind of mythic historical way. Of course, if you're a fine user of the internet, you can distinguish. But say if we put Tolkien on the internet right now and got him to Google stuff like this, and him not knowing, what was Wikipedia and what was actual history, and which was, TolkienFandom.com or whatever, he wouldn't be able to distinguish these things, and it would seem like Lord of the Rings has just become part of our mythic history. But it did not work to entrench the Saxons in their land. Instead, Lord of the Rings has become a universal fantasy, one which allows us to escape the reality of our present circumstances. It allows us to denounce others as orcs, not to focus on our own revival, but to denounce others as orcs, or to denounce particulars, well, not necessarily denounce, but kind of make diminutive certain sections of your own population by saying, oh, they're just the simple hobbits. Yeah, and more than the Bible, you know, Tolkien was writing like very distant Beowulf fan fiction, um, where his works are meant to be mythic, where they have also. I started reading an article about this, didn't finish it, about kind of they use this very particular medieval structure, where instead of like in contemporary kind of fantasy, you'll switch between characters and they'll all basically normally they'll be happening at the same time, unless it's a deliberate flashback. But what happens in the Lord of the Rings is that like you go all the way through Aragorn's story, then you flick back, and then you go all the way through Frodo's story. Elves and orcs in the Eastern Bloc. To go back finally to the thing I mentioned, I would show to soon earlier on. Generally trapped to the last ring bearer, a very popular reinterpretation of the Lord of the Rings, which reconstructs the direction of Tolkien's work in Russia. This work, The Last Ring Bearer, is from the perspective of orcs, who in The Last Ring Bearer are just like a kind of men who are, rather than being under the thrall of the elves, are instead a free people who wish to turn towards industry and technology and progress and so on. And the rings in The Last Ring Bearer were just made as like a distraction for the elves, while the orcs focused on industrial progress. This text makes the orcs, who in Tolkien's text are the generative projects of some kind of Faustian process, they're like horribly corrupted elves who were created in this struggle to grasp from the gods the ability to create new creatures, which is not something which even Morgoth, never mind Sauron, has access to. And so whenever they're trying to create trolls or orcs or whatever, they can only do so by corrupting and decaying and making worse, but under their control, the things that were created by the real god. What happens in The Last Ring Bearer is an attempt to transform these orcs into the heroes and their industrial progress into a heroic one in the face of a reactionary West. In the contemporary form, this is best expressed in the Orc Song of Mikhail Elleros, who spliced the alternative victories of Mordor over the West with the victories of the Soviet Union, before locating loss of Orcness as a reason that Russia has failed. I'll get sorry everyone, I knocked my camera. But yeah, you should listen to that song. It's crazy. I'll read the lyrics at the end. And notably, the popularity of the idea of Russians as orcs, that was something that Russians made up as part of this reinterpretation and revaluation, a very Nietzschean revaluation of the Lord of the Rings, led to Russians becoming orcs. But then once Russians and Ukrainians fell out, as one might say, this led to this disdain being reflected in Ukrainians being like, yes, the Russians are orcs, and then Westerners now denouncing online Russians as orcs without probably understanding the complex genealogical history of this, despite the fact that they probably could have done so anyway. The idea of Westerners denouncing Russians as subhuman orcs is not something which is particularly shocking or surprising, but it's funny that it has this complex genealogical history of reversals together. Russia and Ukraine as a source of vitality. This is the stone-built, petrifying world city, was the exact phrase from Spengler from earlier. In its last extremity, Gondor and the stone-built, petrifying world city of Minas Tirith looked to the youth and vitality of the horsemen of Rohan to augment its own failing powers and numbers. A parody of this is currently happening with Ukraine or Russia, with both Ukraine and Russia both seen as these vital sources by the West in various forms, whether it's the Ukrainian smell of democracy or whether it's the apparent Russian manliness. But in fact, both are even more exhausted and benighted forces which are driving each other to extinction. Ukraine and Russia are both post-apocalyptic societies who have been destroyed and are now using the ruins of a previous age to fight each other. They're using the wreckage of the Soviet army to bombard the wreckage of the Soviet infrastructure. 18 to 24-year-olds have not been called up in Ukraine because they're basically an extinct class. And the situation in Russia is not much better. It's funny when kind of fans of Ukraine, though I imagine fans of Russia do this too, but I don't see it as much, talk about Russian social problems. And Russia has a lot of social problems. But every social problem that Russia has, Ukraine normally has exactly the same social problem, but a bit worse. Russia has a terrible birth rate. Ukraine has a worse one. Russia has a bad life expectancy. Ukraine has a worse one. Russia is a poor country. Ukraine is a poorer country. Russia has a Nazi problem. Ukraine has a bigger Nazi problem, and so on and so on. Russia is only being refreshed by draining its Central Asian periphery, which comes with its own extensive list of problems, most notably the problem of Islamist terrorism. I'm pretty sure every single power station, because I don't think Ukraine's built any power stations over the past 30 years. I think every single power station that Russia is attacked in Ukraine was built by the Soviet Union. Every bridge almost was built by the Soviet Union, and so on and so on. Tolkien's works have been variously reconstructed, but even works of fantasy that meant to be highly freed from Tolkien, meant to be something radically different, we can still see this theme of decline, especially the decline of fantasy. So if we look at the works of Abercrombie, which are meant to be this radically reinterpretation of traditional fantasy, of this grim, dark fantasy, where no one is noble and no one is kind and no one is reasonable, and if they are, they get fucked. The theme of decline in Abercrombie's work is partially inverted, as what is declining is the fantastical elements of the world as the world progresses. But if we think about it, this is not as big a break as the Inheritors would like. Rather, that seems exactly what's happening in The Lord of the Rings. Abercrombie's draining of magic out the world is exactly what's happening in The Lord of the Rings, especially after the events of The Lord of the Rings. It's what Galadriel warns will happen to the elves as they either leave to the west or they diminish away to essentially become forest spirits. The other main reinterpretation is to make things truly cyclic, which is best embodied in the Wheel of Time series. Currently streaming season 3, Amazon Prime. It's very good. Go watch it, or even better, torrent it and then watch it. It's very good. The interpretation of progress and its associating with Nietzschean eternal return is a topic I will cover in a later week. I'll do it next week, unless Ben is back, in which case I won't do it then. I'll do it whenever Ben's not back. So yes, I have done a much longer one than I usually do. I usually only take 25 to 30 minutes to do a solo thing, but now I'm up to 51. But still, if people have questions, now is the time to ask, and I'll finish around the hour mark. If people have questions, if people don't have questions, then I'll just finish up soon. Kilgore Kraut says, I mean, the methodology around Azov and with the Avastol siege, biggest steelworks on the planet built in the Soviet Stalin era, running only at 20% capacity before the war. It was very interesting. After Avastol was destroyed in the siege of Mariupol, both the Ukrainian mayor of Mariupol and the head of the Donetsk People Republic, the Russian-aligned Donetsk People Republic, proposed what should be done with the Avastol steel plant. The Ukrainians suggested it be changed into a memorial for the war, while the Russians said that it should be made into a park. The idea that it should remain a steel plant, the idea that it should go back to becoming a steel plant to produce steel, was never countenanced by any side. Both only could make it into a memorial, a garden, or whatever else. The idea of it ever becoming a steel plant, no, I really like it at the time. So like season 1 was not very good, but I liked it anyway. Season 2, I thought it was one which was very variable, but there were some bits which was so fucking good. Lanfear was so good. And with each season they're improving. Season 3 is even better. And I'm really looking forward to next Thursday, which is going to be the one where Rand goes to Ruidian, and then he goes to this cyclic accounting of generations, which I will certainly end up talking about next week. Can I get an overarching point? I can only relate to Lord of the Rings based on my drug consumption. Is this an answer or a conclusion? The conclusion would be that the works of Tolkien express a Spenglerian concept of history, which is a process of continual decline, which is cyclic, but in the sense that circling the drain is cyclic. And this is very representative, and more representative. It's this classic thing where a text will come out and not really be representative of its present time, but then 100 years later, it seems so representative of our moment. We are living in this kind of declining, childless present where we all rush into the cities and we can no longer imagine doing the things our ancestors did. I was in Durham recently, which is a town in England, where the railway station is on top of a hill, which is really great because it means it's kind of out of the way of the town, of the city. It doesn't pollute the town of the city. And this is possible through a massive, massive viaduct. I was like, if we try to build that now in the UK, it would take 15 years to build and cost hundreds of billions of pounds. And it's not that we've lost the technique of building these things, but rather because of our decline, especially in the West, in the old West in Europe, it becomes so much harder for us to accomplish the things that we know we can do. Isn't like 40 plus books all the size of the Lord of the Rings? If you mean Wheel of Time, yeah, Wheel of Time is 15 books. I don't know if the biggest ones are as big as all 3 of the Lord of the Rings, but some of them get very, very big. Well, Mick says in chat about weed and hobbits and so on, which is of course very much how it's been reinterpreted since the hippie generations. I don't know if you're a fan of the books, Matt. But I think if you aren't a fan of the books, then there won't be a problem. You'll enjoy it. The only problem is if you're a fan of the books and you really don't like it when things don't happen in the books happen in the series. Because in that case, you will just get annoyed because it's not going to stop. There's always going to be things different. But there's just some great bits. There's a really great scene where there's been a complaint for a long time in the TV show that they don't really get into the difference between men and women using magic. But there's a great scene in episode 2, which the actor who plays Rand and the actor who plays Moiraine actually helped co-write, where the two of them discuss. Rand is like, Moraine's like, oh, why are you using a sword? Why don't you use the source, use the power? You need to learn to master it. And Rand's like, my problem's not mastering it. I can embrace it whenever I want. I feel, and really, he feels like a man dying of thirst. He's denying himself drinking from the source, but he doesn't want to because it's filled with filth. And before he mentions that filth point, Moraine's like, oh, I can understand that. And he's like, well, can you understand that this sweetness that you just want to drink and drink and drink about is also completely full of this corruption and filth? And yes, it's a great scene. Maybe better go back and read. I'm just I'm gesturing too aggressively, and it's leading me to knock the webcam out. But I wouldn't advise actually the homework to be that, but rather if there is actually homework, it would also people would benefit most. I think would I don't want to tell people to watch TV. TV is fine, but kind of degenerate. It's better to read things. And this text today, this discussion today, this reading today is mostly reliant on Evening Lands, Spenglerian tropes, and the Lord of the Rings 2016 pots. Yeah, I mean, I think it's certainly, while it has its grimness, it is ultimately an accounting. It is a classic heroic story where all but one of kind of the heroes come back, and not just they come back, but they come back to their homeland, find Saruman's there, and beat him one final time. Like, the heroes stay winning in Lord of the Rings. There isn't really like a major reversal for them. Rather, they're just kind of faced by immensely difficult circumstances. After Boromir dies. Rather, they're just faced with immensely difficult circumstances and have to grind through them. Oh yeah, I was going to read the lyrics of the Orcs song. Okay, I'm going to read you the Orc song of Mikhail Ilekov, which you can find by searching this in YouTube, which is his Orc song in Russian. Brother, remember how we crushed the elfin scum, how their wicked hordes fled to the west, how our regiments pulped the filth of Gondor, so that the white-stoned Mordor would shine more brightly, and set an example of fearlessness for all to see. Under the stern chorale of jets, piggybacked on the fleet-winged chimeras, our red star Nazguls flew. The Gandalf youth fell to orcish swords, though they begged their enemy for mercy, gasping. Heedless of losses, eyes never shut, the steel cohorts of Uruk-hai warriors passed through the plains of Rohan, through the hell of Moria. The last elfin destroyer sank in the river Anduin. The gloomy Osligath was seized by the jarheads of the Goblin Division. How can such a thing simply be forgotten? The beaten tubular trunk of the elephant, or the hurdy-gurdy dance on the Minas Tirith Square, performed by a hobbit who'd pissed his pants. We chopped down the ents to kindle our bonfire. Doors and windows were thrown wide open, and the marauding gnome prayed and swore, while the little elves moaned, "Oh, This is fantastic. Thus ended the war's bloody phase. We won, and all that was left were the details. Trying the wizard and the criminal elfin high command before an impartial Mordor tribunal, and our sentence was rather humane. Only Gandalf and Aragorn did Mordor sentence to death. But disaster struck, and our teacher and leader, our general secretary, Sauronvich, got fucked up one day and fell into a volcano and burnt to a crisp, and the ring's omnipotence dissolved into the volcano, and now began a time of trouble and doubts. The shameful wolves recovered strength and grew stronger. That was when a Zionist Spenglerian named Tolkien threw together his unprincipled Talmud. Historical truth vanished that day, since when we have lost the ridges, plateaus, and shelves, and now unbeatable Mordor is conquered by Rohanites and elves. It's all over now. You wouldn't wish it on your worst enemy. We've made our peace, making our homes in the far-off margins, outside in the melting snow. A hobbit has pissed out the words, "You aren't orcs anymore." We've read The Lord of the Rings from cover to cover. With brighted breath, we learnt all the lies. Of course, our Mordor is totally fucked because we're no longer orcs. Sing it, please. No. I'm such a bad singer. No, this is relevant to The Lord of the Rings because my mother is in a care home thing. And on Friday mornings, I'll go there, and among other things, I'll read to her Lord of the Rings. And she likes when I sing the songs and sing the poems out of the Lord of the Rings. And after one such poem, she complimented my singing, and that was the first time anyone in my life, including her, had ever complimented my singing. Okay, friends, I will be going. I will first be setting the outro video, though, which I will put to the cartoon outro. Oh, did I do that wrong? All right, definitely that. Yeah, braver men than me would have their mother cared for actually in their home. Though, of course, it's not really an option for me at the present, but yes, bye everyone. Bye, 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 bye. See you next week. Same time, same place. I'll be here. Will Ben be here? Different question. Difficult question.